This is a talk that I gave originally in Dublin City Library and Archive on the 23rd of March 2013. And I'd like to thank Maura Kennedy for inviting me at that stage to give that talk. I'm just now getting around to recording it, having become familiar with Zoom. And today is the 22nd of March 2021. Now, the talk I've entitled A Policeman's Lot, the Dwyers of Cappanahanagh, and it's about my father's side of the family. It includes themes and stories, even myths, and various approaches to things. My grandfather's people came from the townland of Cappanahanagh in the parish of Murroe in East Limerick. And it's in the Clare Glens and it's beside Glenstall. You'll see it there on the map on the right, Limerick City on the left. They were tenant farmers in Cappanahanagh on the Barrington estate. And the talk will focus on grandfather and his children. Now, not all of them, because I wouldn't have time, but there's probably another talk in that. I've concentrated on those with the most interesting stories, perhaps. But there's one item I want to get out of the way first, and it's about sources, because the sources, and particularly parish registers from the parish, are a vital source in sorting out the genealogy. Now, in the National Library, they have film that was taken in the 50s of the various parish registers. And most of these are clearly accessible. You hand in your docket, you get a little box with the film in it, and you put it into a microfilm machine or whatever you call it, and you look up the stuff. And you can go through the parish registers of most of the parishes. The odd parish has not been recorded. Now, there I am in the National Library. I give in my chit for Murroe Parish, and I go down and sit at my machine. And eventually a lady turns up with a little box, as usual, and she says to me, "This is the film you're looking for." And I said, "Thanks very much," and put out my hand to take it. "But I can't give it to you," she said. So I said, "Why not?" Well, she said, "You need the bishop's permission." And I said, "How do I get that?" And she said, "Well, what you do, you ring the palace and you ask for permission. If they're giving you permission, they contact us, and then we give you the film." So that's fine. So I accompany her back to the desk, where there is an old hand on the desk, and I explained to him that I need the bishop's permission. And he said, "Which bishop?" And I said, "Clifford." And he said, "Forget it." He said, "He never gives his permission." Now, that was very annoying. And there's a whole story there that I'm not going into. But I got around this eventually, fortuitously, I suppose, because a relative down there is an undertaker. And his wife had access to the parish, obviously, because she participates in the undertaking business. And she got access through the parish priest there to a computer printout of the digital records. These digital records are held by the heritage centres. A heritage centre to look at, to get them to do a search, would cost €80, €80. And I certainly wasn't going to part with that. And that whole financial thing is another story as well. So I got around it effectively. The printouts are in the parish offices. This relation went in and she took photographs of, I suppose, a few hundred pages. And she was interested in some other stuff. So she sent up the stuff relevant to me. And I had JPEGs. I took them all, took the information from them, put them in a spreadsheet. So I now have a spreadsheet of the parish records. Now, there was one entry that intrigued me. My people were married to a Healy, a lady Healy down there. And that in those days was variously spelt. There's a lot of different spellings appear, but it was spelt Hely. Now, I had traced a lot of my people, but there was a gap. And the gap, there was one attributed to a Mally, Mally, And if I thought if only that had been a Healy, Hely, then I'd be great, because it would put a piece into a jigsaw for me. And of course, down there is Mally country. You've Desi O'Malley and Dun O'Malley, and Limerick is Mally's. So whoever was transcribing would certainly have had a majority of Mally's over Healy's. But anyway, I I wanted this person, this Mally person, to be a Healy. And to cut a long story short, when I looked at a lot of entries by the same priest, examined his writing in great detail, I was quite happy that the entry was in fact a Healy, and build in a little jigsaw piece for me. So that was great. Subsequent to all of this, there was a lot of controversy about lack of access to these records. And eventually, the National Library just outfaced the bishops. They told the bishops to bugger off, and they just made the records freely available. So I was able then to check the actual record itself, and that's where I was able to compare the writing. Now, this particular character, Pat Rabbit, he's from down west, and Pat has been leader of the Labour Party, among other things, and he has been a minister. And he was quite rude to me once in the Public Accounts Committee, and I have sort of held it in for him ever since. So I'm going to give him the chance to display his talents in the course of this talk. He is effectively what I would call a pompous didact. So we'll make use of that aspect of his character. And the question is, what have I learned so far from what I just told you? And the answer, well, part of the answer is, don't let these guys get you down. Just stay with it. And the second point is, there is a need always to see originals. Look at the census forms, look at the original parish records, regardless of what has been digitized, if you can get your hands on them, because very often there is extra information, or you can manipulate them to a greater extent. Now, this is the original homestead in Cappanahanagh, where my people were from. It's gone a while now. It's not there. It's not actually there any longer. But the land is still in family ownership and has been built on. So that is the same view today. There's not a trace of the homestead. And this is a view of my cousin John, and he's John Meehan because there was a female in the descent down along the line, so the surname has changed. And he is standing there at the grave of my ancestors. He's the undertaker. He's standing at the grave of my ancestors, where there is still a need for some sort of a memorial. And I think he has in mind to get a cross put there. He may even have done it since I have been down there. I'll be referring to 3 RIC men, the Royal Irish Constabulary. And they are Michael, my grandfather, his brother William, and Michael's father-in-law, Luke. In those days, the eldest son got the farm, so you have the other sons. What are they going to do? And the local police was certainly a career that a lot of them went into if they could get references and so forth. So these 3 guys anyway, and there are some more, but these 3 guys ended up in the RIC, and I want to actually mention them. Now, the RIC is problematic, I have to say, because not only were they the local police force, but they were also the eyes and ears of the British administration, which you can look on as an administration of occupation if you have a mind to. And they were the enforcers of British policy. And British policy was not always gentle. And unfortunately, the RIC, as you can see there, participated in evictions. And it's a bit of an ambivalence now that I have about my ancestors, that I don't know to what extent they were involved in these. I assume they must have been involved in some of them. Now, this is Michael. This is my grandfather, whom I never met. He was in the RIC from 1881 until 1911. Now, the RIC, he retired in 1911. The RIC only recruited single men. And when you joined the RIC, you were not allowed to get married for 7 years. So this was a particular problem for some people. And of course, it gave, I was going to say your opponents, but it gave those men who did not join the RIC a competitive advantage in getting married to the local women. So Granda apparently was a little bit worried about this, and according to family story anyway, he stashed Granny in Liverpool. I don't know what he thought about the Liverpool fellas, but he stashed her in Liverpool anyway to be out of the way of the local predatory males. Now, another thing is that in the RIC, you are not allowed to serve in your own county. And that's a reasonable rule for a police force. You'd get too involved with the people. And equally, you are not allowed to serve in your wife's county for the same reason. And quite surprisingly, Michael ended up in Mayo, which of course is different from Limerick, and it's not his county. But he married a girl from Mayo. So that was then his wife's county. And he stayed in that county until after Luke, that's his father-in-law, who was also RIC, until after he retired. And my own suspicion is that Luke being in the RIC in some way made the family a trusty family or whatever. And Luke may well have been fighting to keep him there because he wanted to stay in Mayo. And the interesting thing is that when Luke died in 1910, Michael actually resigned from the RIC in 1911 because they were trying to move him out of Mayo. So it's just an interesting little thing. Now, I couldn't resist this montage. This is a drawing of RIC people, and I've stuck my grandfather's face into it just to give you an idea of what might face you if you had met him in uniform. Now, Granny's father, that's Michael, was married to Margaret, and Margaret's father was Luke. And this is Luke Riley. And Luke was in the RIC from way back 1853 until 1884 when he retired from the RIC. And interestingly enough, he would have been very much, I suspect, involved in the land agitation, presumably trying to suppress it. Michael Davitt and Irishtown are, I won't say just down the road, but they're not too far away. And of course, then there was the apparition of the Blessed Virgin in Knock in 1879, and at which time Luke was stationed in Kilchuma, which is only a few miles from Knock. And at that time, the authorities mobilized all the RIC people in the local area to do reports on these apparitions, because these were, I mean, these possibly had subversive implications at the end of the day. So that's Luke. Now, Michael's brother, William, I mentioned him there. He also went into the RIC, and they would have joined up in Limerick. He had a short, he lived a short, sorry, that's Knock, the shrine in Knock. Michael, or William, lived, William's career was in the RIC was quite short. It was a short-lived and glorious career of 5 years, from 1882 to 1887. And in the course of it, you can see in some of the entries there, he was fined 15 shillings in 1884. He was fined 30 shillings in 1887. So his record was not unblemished to start with. And up in the top right-hand corner of the entry there, you can see that he left supposedly to emigrate. And in the year that he left, he actually turned up locally married. So that became well, it wasn't a problem for him because he got out of it, but he got out of it obviously to marry and not to emigrate. But emigrate was the more respectable reason. He became then a publican in Tipperary, and he's entered in the census as an RIC pensioner Now, I suspect he wasn't within an ass's roar of getting a pension for the what'll I say, inglorious 5 years that he served in the RIC. But however, he's down as an RIC pensioner in Crowell in Tipperary. And I would just mention in passing that one of his daughters married the son of Michael Tierney, who had been the president of UCD. Michael Tierney had married one of the daughters of Owen MacNeil. So I'm actually related through William uh, to Owen MacNeil, to Michael Tierney, and to Moore MacDougall and the former Attorney General Michael MacDougall. So there you are. Now, let's go back to this wonderful man. So what do we learn from what we've just dealt with? Well, the first thing is check out RIC records. And one of the ways of doing this, you could get lost in these ledgers very easily, but one of the ways of doing this is to use Jim Herlihy's book. And this I have said publicly is one of the most boring books ever written, because it's just a list, a chronological list of all the RIC people with their service numbers. But using that book, you can trace who you're looking for. For example, this is the number here, and you can see the Michael Dwyer's How Do I Know Which Is My Man? So I found him through that book, and that gave me his service number. The service number brings you to the ledger. The ledger gives you at least one row right across, which is a sort of an abstract of their career with the various entries, including the one that you saw part of for William just a little earlier. The other thing that that we will have learned, I think, is to, that I've learned, is to look at the census original form, which is in PDF form and accessible on the internet, because this gives you the actual form that was filled up by the household. In this form, and some of the stuff in the form is quite interesting, because people put things down and they didn't rub out things in those, they just crossed them out, but you can read them. So here we have the enumerator, which is Michael Dwyer, who is the man who goes around with the form, and that's my grandfather as an RIC man. They were the enumerators, went around distributing the forms and checking the forms. On the right-hand side, you have Michael Dwyer, the same man who was head of household. So he has signed it there as head of household. And as the enumerator, I think he signed it in the wrong place, and that's the one that's crossed out. So this is a thrice signed census form, signed 3 times by the same man. So these are just small little things. Now, these are in-laws, Ferguson's, and I'm not covering that part of the family, but I'm just pointing out here, if you look carefully there, you'll see that you were asked in the form for where you were born, and basically it's asking for what county. And you'll see there that individual entries had been made: Bow Park, Nina, Kells and Gorey along on the left-hand side, and they've been crossed out and replaced with counties. But that original information that was crossed out is still available to you there if you look for it. Now, I'm going to come to one of Michael's sons. That would be my father's brother, and that is John P. Dwyer. And I'm calling this section The Tanks That Weren't, and you'll see why in a minute. And this is John P. Dwyer on the Somme. Now, John P. Dwyer, who's an uncle of mine, was born in 1894 and he died in 1916 on the Somme. In the Mayo Feis, he won a book prize that I think was given to him by Pádraig Pearse. So he must have had some Irish language enthusiasm of some sort. He worked in the civil service in London, and basically that's how he got caught up in the war effort. Now, my original knowledge of him was simply this memorial card, which was in the family. There were a lot of those around in those days. You can see on the left the glorious, whatever it is, the great sacrifice and the great war for civilization. That's on the reverse of it. And then on the near part of it, it says here where he died and on the date that he died. I learned that he was a member of the Civil Service Rifles. And as I said to you, that's I think the uh, some of the civil service people. He wasn't a military person, but I think it was like going to the gym or something. That sometimes they use these facilities and joined up as background or whatever. Then the war breaks out, and then suddenly you're a soldier. So I think that's what happened to him, and I learned about that connection from through my cousin via the Military History Society. So I also learned of a book by Jill Knight, who worked in the Department of Trade and Industry in Britain, but she had a relation in the Civil Service Rifles, and she set about investigating it and wrote a book about it. And it's an absolutely fantastic book. It's not one of these official regimental things from the top down. It's from the bottom up, and it's full of letters and photographs from soldiers, and it gives you a tremendous feeling for the actual the atmosphere of the actual operations and what was going on. Now, John is not mentioned in it, but at the same time, you can imagine that this is the environment that he was operating in. Absolutely. Now, on the Somme in summer in 1916, there were three woods, which would be sort of high areas that were obstructing the Allied advance. There was Delville Wood, there was another one whose name I can't quite remember, and there was then High Wood. Now, in the summer, they took the first two, fine, but they didn't take High Wood. And in September, they decided to launch an attack on High Wood. And in September, this particular operation was the first use of the tanks in the First World War. Now, the tank commander and I was going to say the tank commanders because there would have been more than one of them, and General Barter, who was in charge, advised against using the tanks because there were fallen trees and shell holes, uneven terrain, and all this. But he was overruled by the Corps commander, and tanks were going to go in, and that's it. Now, as it turned out, when the guys went over the top, the tanks were late. So they would have followed rather than preceded the men. Some of them got lost. Some of them got stuck and went on fire. And effectively, the tanks were useless. They were an impediment to the operation. But High Wood was taken. So the operation technically was a success, but the cost was enormously high. And the reliance on tanks meant that there was no artillery cover. The tanks were useless and the casualties were higher. Now, the General Barter, was summarily relieved of his command in secret. He died in 1931, but he wasn't vindicated until well after his death in 1938. Now, meanwhile, the morning after this disaster of an operation, we had, I think it was General Haig, yes, Haig at the time. This is a headline from the Times of the 18th of September. The operation was on the 15th, 16th. The great new advance, Sir Douglas Haig's victory, splendid services of the tanks. Now, you can see how propaganda works. It was an absolute, the tank part of it was an absolute disaster. Now, this is High Wood today. You can see it behind there from what's called the Caterpillar Valley Cemetery. And the caterpillars, I assume, refers to the caterpillar wheels on the tanks. So it's a bit of an irony, really. He is commemorated, John, in Thiepval, on that great big memorial in Thiepval, Belgium. His name is in the books, the 4 books in Island Bridge that are in those little buildings. And he's also commemorated in the Mayo Peace Park in Castlebar. So his body is under the earth somewhere out there, but at least he's commemorated in a few places. And John has posed a particular problem for me, because I would never wear a poppy. I would think twice about it. I mean, I was once almost approached by a soldier on the bridge in Strabane when I was driving through with a gun in one hand and a collection can with poppies in the other. Fortunately, he didn't come near me. He probably saw the southern registration. But I mean, I was gearing up to refuse to take a poppy off him, because the poppy has been a sign of, as far as we're concerned, a sign of oppression, and it had been appropriated by the Unionists in Northern Ireland. And like, to be seen wearing a poppy, certainly for anyone with any nationalistic leanings, was a mortal sin. However, my uncle had died on the Somme, so what was I to do? So I actually wore a poppy for 2 years, explicitly on purpose, in memory of my uncle. And that is another story, which I am not going to go into. So we'll come back to Pat Rabbit again. And what have we learned from all of that? Well, it started with a memorial card, and I asked questions. So you find stuff and you ask questions of anyone in the family who's around. Then you trawl the internet with Google, and that's where I found Jill Knight's book. So that was a very fruitful exercise. So we come to another of Michael's sons, Paddy. Now, I've entitled this one "Skinny Dipping," and you'll see why in a minute. And this is Ballinasloe, and the Irish house there is why I have that photograph there. And it's no longer obviously looks like that. But this arose from a story by my cousin Colette, what I call from the Baelitis, from the oral history. And Colette's story was that Paddy was apprenticed to a draper in Ballinasloe, and that's the draper shop there, the Irish house that you can see. And one Sunday, Paddy was out with a number of his mates, fellas, and he decided he was going to go for a swim. So the River Suck goes through Ballinasloe. So he took off his clothes and jumped in. Now, that was a problem. That's a very treacherous river. And he got into trouble. And one of his mates jumped in and was holding him up in the water when what came around the corner but a rowing boat rowed by a man with 2 women in the back of it. Now, that's a common story. I mean, everyone is agreed on that much of the story, but it diverges then after that, depending on which side you're on. The boatman said that he attempted to come to Paddy's assistance, try and give him an oar to hang on to, but that the current was too strong and the boat drifted to the bank. Now, this guy had 2 women in the back. So while the boat was drifting to the bank, he got rid of the 2 women and came back, and Paddy was gone. Everybody else has a different story, that he didn't attempt to go to Paddy's rescue at all, but when he saw what was going on, he went straight to the bank to dump the 2 women and then came back and Paddy was gone. And the inquest in Ballinasloe actually criticized him seriously. Now, I had difficulty finding him because, number one, I couldn't find him in the General Records Office. He wasn't in the recorded deaths, which was a bit of a problem. And I couldn't find him in the Irish Newspaper Archive at that time either, because although the newspaper archive covered the Connaught Tribune, which would have been the local newspaper, at least one of them, and did a sort of Google search and gave you the results in the way Google does, most of them were unreadable. They were absolute garbage. And this was because the reader at the time, uh, or the OCR reader at the time, the technology wasn't very advanced. So that was no good. I actually found in the records, I found a likely candidate, but when I actually put in for the full form, I found that he was actually son of a farmer and he was killed by a train. I short-circuited this exercise by checking out, through my cousin Matt, checking out uh, the tombstone in Ballyhaunis graveyard, which had a date, May 1922. I was then able to go back to the digitally archived records and browse the Connacht Tribune for that date. And I found it. And in fact, the inquest is in it, and it's a full-page inquest in a broadsheet. And it's like a court reporter taking shorthand notes in court and then publishing them. It's absolutely riveting. The inquest at the time. So that you can see there the Connacht Tribune. You can see the inquest there printed, and I just reproduced there the actual headlines on it. Young Ballyhaunis man's death on the Suck, which is the river. Perished in the midst of help. Strange disclosures at the coroner's inquest. Only a poor Catholic. It had been said at the inquest that had he been a Protestant, he wouldn't have drowned, because the boatman was a Protestant and Paddy was a Catholic. And and the man with the boat was reprimanded by the jury, and there were scenes in the courthouse. People were very upset, and my grandfather was there with steam coming out of his ears, and he shouted out that you have to the boatman that you have traded the life of my son for the modesty of two women. And he obviously didn't think that that was a very good deal at all. So uh, now, Paddy's death notice in the paper in Ballyhaunis was rather strange. It said there, okay, death by drowning, brother of Willie O'Dwyer, national teacher, and then high mass and so forth. So where's the daddy and the mammy? I mean, they were both alive at the time. But at that time, this was the Civil War was about to break out the following month. And at that time, I mean, there were a lot of tribal feeling throughout the country, let's say. And at that time, there were RIC men, well, they would have been former RIC men at that stage, because we had the Free State, former RIC men in both Ballinasloe and Ballyhaunis, I've looked at the records, were being taken out and shot. And his father was a retired RIC man. So I suspect that they didn't want to draw any attention to Michael in the death notice. And of course, the brother Willie, who was the eldest in the family, would have been very well known. I was going to say throughout the country, but certainly throughout the county, because he was the secretary of the Irish National Teachers Organisation at the time. So what have we learned from that? Well, one thing we've learned is that the absence of a name in the register wasn't unusual, and that's particularly in times of community stress. Ballinasloe at the time was in turmoil, and it was occupied by the irregulars, who are effectively, if you like, the IRA, who were in opposition at the time to the state, and they were fighting the newly formed state. Um, it would be helpful if the GRO released digitized, even if only the indexes of those records. And of course, some of those records are now available. The other thing I learned was, if you come up against an obstacle, try and work around it. And that's where the gravestone came in. I did realize that newspapers often carried verbatim reports from this. I realized that verbatim reports of things like inquests, and just to be aware that these things are out there somewhere and they can be very, very useful. I learnt also that the Bailides, or the oral tradition, which is what set me off, my cousin Colette's remarks, which is what set me off pursuing this case in the first place, uh, it was almost right. I've told you the story of what happened. Her story was that Paddy had been in a boat with in mixed company, some women in it, and out on a lake, and that he decided to go skinny dipping, jumped off the boat, took off his clothes, jumped off the boat, and that the boat, because there were women in the boat, the boatman wouldn't let him back in again, and he drowned. And I found that a most difficult story to understand, because I suspect that had that been the story, the boatman would have been taken out and something done to him. But you can see that the real story has most of those elements in it, but it's a different story. And without the, what will I say, the spur of Colette's story, I wouldn't have gone about chasing this thing up at all. And I still wouldn't know anything about it. So the next person we come to is Jane. That's my father's sister, Michael's daughter. This is Kilchima, and it's a sculpture by Sally McKenna, which is really, it really gets to me. You can look at this guy is an emigrant. He's going to emigrate, and he's emigrating with that small suitcase, and that's the beginning and the end of what he's bringing with him. Emigration in those days touched most families. Those in the West, in general, went to the United States. For example, in Lahordan, not too far away, there's a whole clatter of people who went as a group and went down in the Titanic. And that particular village has felt the impact of that. And because people went in groups, if something went wrong, the impact was very geographically concentrated back home. Now, I couldn't find Jane in the 1901 or 1911 censuses. They're the only two censuses that we have digitized at the moment, complete national censuses. The story about why we don't have others is for another day, but they are complete, and they've done an absolutely magnificent job in digitizing them. It's magic. But I couldn't find Jane in the 1901 or the 1911. Now, I knew Jane had gone to America because I had met some of her descendants. And I wasn't surprised that she wasn't around in the 1911 census. But pre-digitization, you'd have to know where you were looking for a person. You'd have to know where they lived, because you would look up the census results for that particular street. And there was no other way of doing it. And I looked up the Ballyhaunis house, and she wasn't in it in 1911. No problem. I looked up the Ballyhaunis house for 1901, and she wasn't in it. And that really took me by surprise. So Jane was basically unfindable for the moment at the time. And my cousin Brian, who I think that he's an authority in these matters, or at least that his brother Michael was an authority in these matters, has said that Michael had looked for Jane, and that Michael had come to the conclusion that Jane didn't exist, which was a difficult one, given that I'd met some of her descendants. But when I met her descendants, it was at a time before I became curious about the family history, and effectively they were just visiting Yanks from America. Like I didn't ask them any questions at all. But I mentioned Nora Meehan, Nora Fogarty, her maiden name, down in Cappanahanagh in Murroe. And I was out one time around the country, going to various locations, driving around, chasing up various relations on different sides of the family. And I got an email from this woman, Nora Meehan, who said, I think we're related. If you're ever around, drop in and we'll overnight you. I replied back to her, well, what about tomorrow? Because I was down in Birr at the time, and I was leaving Birr, and I wasn't sure where I was going next. So down I went to Nora's in Cappanahanagh, which was great, because that was the location of my father's ancestors. And we were sitting there that evening, and she was explaining to me how she had got various forms, census forms from Dublin, because this was pre-digital. And she would send up a request and they'd post forms down to her. And she was showing me the forms of people from my grandfather and great grandfather's era, who were in the house on the night of 1901, the 1901 census. And what did I see? There was Jane. Jane had been staying with the grandparents, and I had no way of knowing that, and there was no way I could have found her. Today, I could just put her name in and I'd be offered a choice of Jane Dwyers or Jane O'Dwyer's, and I would have found her at the push of a button, if you like. But pre-digitization, this was a very time-consuming job, and there were parts of it that just couldn't be done. So I would like to record a vote of thanks to Katrina Crowe here from the National Archives, who fought and fought and fought for the release of the censuses and to get them digitized. And she negotiated all that stuff herself, and it's an absolutely marvelous, marvelous project. Can't say too much about it. But anyway, I then found Jane coming into the United States through Ellis Island and their records, and she came on a ship called the Baltic. This was in 1908, and at the time it was the largest ship afloat, and that, of course, claim to fame was taken over by the Titanic 4 years later. She travelled with a group from Ballyhaunis and an uncle and an aunt, and she was going to them to the States. They were taking her back, and again, a group from Ballyhaunis, a group from Laherdan, and this is the way it worked. Granny's sister was married to a MacBride in the Bronx, and they're the people that she went to. And Jane raised a family then in the Bronx. Now, I didn't come across, somebody in Australia linked up Jane's granddaughter, Kathy, to me. And Kathy was unbelievable. She had stories, she had photographs, absolutely unbelievable. And that's Joseph MacBride there, who was the husband of Granny's sister. And they're the people that took Jane in, so to speak. So Jane then married John O'Connor from Longford, and she raised 5 lads during the Depression. They all went to high school, 4 went to college, and just to give you 2 illustrations from the sons. Again, each of those is a story, and I obviously don't have time to do them. That's Jane in the middle. So Bill was in World War II. He was a lieutenant, and Jane was very proud of this. He went to cadet school, got an education, and Jane was herself was a proud American, if you like. And Bill was going to sit one day an examination for, I think it was the fire service, but the fire service and the police over in New York are just permeated, even more so in those days, by the Irish. And to the extent that they're almost cartoon figures, some of them are used in that way. And Jane did not want her son to go into this sort of particular Irish professional enclave. And on the day that he was to go for interview or do his test, she snuck into his room and turned off his alarm. And he missed getting in. He subsequently became a lawyer. Now, there's an alternative version to that story, although it mightn't be an alternative, both of them might be true, that he had been out drinking rather heavily the night before and was unlikely to have woken up anyway. But however, I only heard that one yesterday. So he became a lawyer rather than a fireman. And he boasted apparently that he was the highest lawyer in the state of New York, because he was up on the 76th floor of the Empire State Building. So there you have it. Now, to take a second son, a totally different example, and this is Joe. Now, Joe had a very bad speech disability, but apparently got through high school. He was part of Dr. Sachs' experiment in the late 60s, where Sachs was using drugs to overcome various forms of disability. He was treating victims of in particular, of the 1920s epidemic of encephalitis lethargica, whatever that is. He was treating them anyway with a drug called L-Dopa. And he was apparently having great success. Now, Joe had this speech disability. There was a day when Kathy answered the phone, and this perfectly normal voice came from the other end, looking to speak to her mother, and she hadn't the faintest idea who it was. And it turned out that that was Joe. And there was great rejoicing because Joe appeared to be cured. But unfortunately, as we had seen in various films, the cure sort of wore off eventually, and he reverted. The particular experiment in question has been immortalized in film, and it's the film Awakenings with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. So my cousin was one of the people who, if you like, were successfully for a short time experimented on in that particular experiment. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, the first thing is never give up. Park something if you have to come back to it. And above all else, tell everybody what you're doing. Whether you do it online or whether you do it when you meet people, or don't wait for them to ask you what you're doing. Just tell them you're doing your family history. I have found putting the simplest of stuff up online has meant relations found me. I have raised the subject with people that I've known for years, and suddenly found out that there has been some sort of a family connection. So speak up is the first thing, and get a presence on the internet, because that's where I was found by some of the people. So that's Joe. Now I would like to come to my father's sister Nora. Nora, I was told Nora married Tommy Kelly, and I was told that there was a bar in the Olympia Theatre in Dublin called Kelly's Bar, because Nora's husband, Tom Kelly, had been a barman in the Olympia for many, many years. So this was the family, as it turned out, the family myth. Now, this is Nora, my Aunt Nora, the lady who made the best chips I ever tasted. But leaving that aside, as I said, she married Tom Kelly. Now, Nora and her sister B married two Kelly brothers. Tom was one of them, Nora married, and Michael was the other, whom B married. And that's Tom there, a gentleman. And that's Tom a little later. Now, he was 63 years in the Olympia, and that's him later. And this is Maureen's bar. Unfortunately, I learned that the Kelly in question was another person, but it's now Maureen's bar, And that's Maureen Grant, and she has been there for years and years. And I spoke to her, and she said that Tom was a gentleman and that he trained her in. And when she was actually training in there, she had a baby, and she used to bring the baby in. And this was Tom was very, very solicitous of her at the time. So the bar is not named after him, but she couldn't praise him enough as being a complete gentleman. And I'm taking it, that's her from another publication when she was younger, Behind the Bar, and that's the bar today. And I'm taking it that her compliments about Tom are an awful lot more important and mean an awful lot more to the family than simply a bar being named after him. So, what have we learned from that? Well, we've learned in this case that the Bailitus, or the oral tradition in the family, was clearly wrong. But in following it up, we came across something more interesting. And it raised or emphasized the difficulty in this sort of stuff of making superficial connections on the basis of names. You want to find people. You're predisposed, if you find the same name anywhere and a connection, to think that those two things are connected. So you need corroboration, and in the course of looking for corroboration, you may actually end up with something quite interesting. So I think this is the last one I have. Finally, I come to my own parents, Sis and Luke. Luke is Michael's son, and Sis is on the Mortimer side of the family. So I'm not going into them at all specifically today. I'm just dealing with the Dwyers. But my father is the excuse here for dealing with this part. Now, my mother worked in the civil service in the labour exchange. That's the unemployment exchange, and she has lots of stories coming from that. When she was well, in those days, when you got married, if you were in the civil service, when you got married, if you were a woman, you had to retire from the civil service, which was called the marriage bar, and that wasn't abolished until I think 1970s, maybe 75 or there around that. Now, when she was resigning on marriage, a colleague of hers, MF, as she was known, Mary Frances O'Connell from Cork, wrote a verse. And this is the verse. And in the verse, it says that my father, who was pursuing her at the time, had threatened that if she didn't marry him, he'd throw himself into the Liffey. Now, this is a slightly unfortunate expression if it was actually made, because my mother's father in 1918 had actually drowned in the Liffey, but I don't think my father knew that at the time. So when they got married, they set up in Howth. You can see the tram there in Howth. The station is on the left, and on the right, the tram goes up or comes down from, as the case may be, Howth Head. And just in passing, a small thing of interest there, you'll see that the trolley on the tram, that's the little aerial type thing sticking up on the top of it, you'll see that that's pulled down. Normally that's up, and it rolls along a wire which gives power to the tram. It's down there because the tram is coming down the hill on gravity alone. If you look under the bridge, immediately under the bridge on the right, you'll see a single story house or whatever, which is number 1, Harbour Road. And then you see a 2-story house, which is number 2, and that is basically what turned into the gem shop. You can see it a little more clearly there. The middle door of the 2-story house is the entrance. There is a room to the right, which is part of the living quarters, and the living quarters are upstairs. And the room to the left, when you go in there, was actually a shop. It didn't have a shop front or anything. So that's that's the gem in Oath. Um, they seem to have made a success of it because they trebled the net profit in the first 3 years, and they doubled the value of the goodwill in the first 3 years. So they were being very successful there um, in the shop. And this is the modern version. Um, the earlier one was from the 50s. They got married in 42, and this is the modern version now. You can see that the whole lower floor has been turned, the whole ground floor has been turned into a shop, and there's what looks like serious extension out the back. What you might notice as well is there's a wall behind the house there, and that actually is the tram. That is the tram line. Now there was another story in the family, and it was one sentence, and that was that Gordon Brewster, the artist, died in the Mammy shop. Now that was an interesting one, because Gordon Brewster was an artist primarily, but also chief cartoonist in the Irish Independent. And I had been following him up purely out of interest from that particular story that he died in the shop. And then I wondered, well, did he die in the shop or did he just take ill in the shop and was he carted off to a hospital or somewhere where he died? So I looked up his death cert. Sorry, that's another shot of the gem. They change the front every so often. And I'm not really sure why, but anyway. Um, this is Gordon Brewster's, an extract from his death cert, which gives the place of death where he actually died. And that is the gem Hoth you can see there. His father was, I think, the general manager, or certainly senior management in the Irish Independent. It was only, well, say years and years and years later that I happened to mention him, and my cousin Gemma told me, ah, yes, I knew that, and she said your mother rushed out from behind the counter and said an act of contrition in his ear. Now that would have been typical of the times, where the soul was considered more important than the body. And you said an act of contrition in someone's ear so that they wouldn't be cast down to hell. And even if they had to spend some time in purgatory on their way to heaven, at least they were on the right road. Um, the National Library uh, acquired a fabulous collection of originals of his cartoons. And you can see here that they're quite elaborate. They're done in pen and wash. And uh, again, they're quite lively. You can see the movement in it. I mean, the man was an artist. And the library acquired this collection. I don't know where they acquired it from, but it's a collection of about 400 odd originals of his cartoons. He asked for the cartoons to be returned from him after they got printed. So there's this fabulous collection, and the National Library have digitized them, and they're now available on the internet for anybody to browse through. So that was Hoth. That's where I started off my life, so to speak. And my parents then moved to Dollymount. We went out to stay with the granny, and we then ended up in Ballybrack in Killiney Bay, where the mother was back into the shop. And this was our shop in Ballybrack, and newsagents and so forth. So what have we learned so far? Well, one thing is that no detail is too small or insignificant in a good story. Follow up the details. And one thing leads to another. So we take our leave of Pompous Pat here. Now, finally, back to Ballyhaunis. This is the granny. And there she is again. And she's looked after by her daughter Molly, who is the youngest. And Molly never married, and Molly looked after her uh, up to her death. And Granny was a lady who, even when she was bedridden, she was in charge. She was one of those characters, very strong-minded characters. And this is an extract from her death certificate, which you will see says that she died of old age without dementia when certified. Now, I can see Granny, before she died, saying to Molly, Molly, I am going to die of old age, and I want it on my death certificate that I did not have dementia. And she was that sort of a lady, and that was the result that she got. So, leaving it there, maybe with those particular extracts. As I say, there's a lot more that there could be. I'll leave it there for now. Okay.